I'm Diana Wentworth, and I'm so excited to be with you. I'm the co founder of the Inside Edge Foundation for Education. It's been a forum for thought leaders and all kinds of people who are activists in the world where they meet and greet and expand who they are. And we've been recording 1,500 of our past speakers. And we're going to take the very best of these and offer them on our YouTube channel. We're starting to post them weekly. So what you want to do is go to our YouTube channel and to subscribe to it, and you'll get all kinds of information about what we're offering. It's so thrilling to be offering this legacy to you now. It feels really good.
It's really nice to be back here at Inside Edge. Really thrilled. I just spent a few years working on this, and I'm going to give you a sort of overview of a very fascinating life and why I think it's a life whose details and nuances are very worth learning about and reading about, not just because it's a great story, but also because we can derive a lot of benefit ourselves from the inspiration and example. I want to answer the question that I've been asked countless times since I started working on this a few years ago. Why write a biography of someone whose autobiography, the Autobiography of a Yogi, is an iconic book that millions of people have read? Why bother? And the answer I give is, I read Autobiography of a Yogi in 1970. I was on the early stages of my own spiritual path. I never became a formal student of Yogananda's, or let alone a disciple, but he was one of the many spiritual teachers that informed and inspired my spiritual life. I still have the hardcover copy of Autobiography of a Yogi that I read 48 years ago. And I've moved a lot. That was in Massachusetts. And I still have it. And the cover says it costs $5. Now, I know I would not have had $5 to spend on a hardcover book in those days. So I must have borrowed it and never returned it. And so I wrote this book to work off the karma of that act of greed. The other answer is, when I wrote my previous book, American Veda, which is also here, I had to write about all the gurus who came here and all the people who were influential in bringing these precious teachings of the Indian spiritual traditions to the West, and which I think is one of the most important historic developments of the last 100 years or so. It has informed and transformed all of our spiritual lives in one way or another. And when I was doing that, I became more familiar, of course, with the human story of Yogananda's life, and like I did with all the others. And it stood out for a number of reasons. For one, I came to appreciate even more than I had before how important he was in this story of East coming to West. A seminal figure and a monumental figure. The LA Times called him the 20th century's first superstar guru. And it's true. Of all the gurus who came in the 60s and 70s that most of us are familiar with, he was a predecessor. There were predecessors to him, but he had a huge, huge impact. And that impact endures because of his autobiography and the institutions that he established before he passed. But the other thing was, I found his personal story, the human story, to be a really compelling narrative. And I realized there's an awful lot about it that's not in his own autobiography. I discovered that less than 10% of the autobiography of a yogi is about his life in America. He came here in 1920, and he spent all but 16 months of the next 32 years here in America, mostly in Southern California, in LA and Encinitas. And this became his home from age 27 until his death at 59. This is where he did his important work. This is where he established his headquarters. This is what made him the Yogananda who became so famous. Very little about it is really in his own autobiography. Some of his disciples had written memoirs of their time with the Guru, but they tend to be sort of tribute books worth looking at and were important for me in my research, but they were not full-on biographies, birth to death, as we say. And I thought there was room for an objective outsider with some credibility to tell the story of his life. And I set out to emphasize the human story. Because whatever you think a spiritual giant like Yogananda is, and there's people who think he was an avatar, an incarnation of God, there's people who think he was just a superstar guru and a great leader. Whatever you think, he was still a human being. And like all of us, he had a background and a family and an environment, and he had adventures, and he had made decisions, and he had emotions, and he had ups and downs. And all of those nuances that make a really good narrative were present in his life, as they tend to be with people of great accomplishment. And we read biographies of great people, not only because they inspire us and inform us, but because they're really interesting. And the human story tends to get lost when it comes to spiritual giants like this. And so that I set out to research that more deeply and emphasize it, that human part of the story of somebody whose spiritual accomplishments were virtually unsurpassed. So if you want a good read, I recommend it. So Yogananda was born Mukunda Lal Ghosh. This was his parents, Bhagavati Ghosh and Gyanapraga Ghosh. And he was born in India, in the city of Gorakhpur, in this home. This is a recent picture of the same building, so it's now wired. But in 1893, when he was born, you would not have seen an automobile or all the wiring. His family moved around a lot in his early days. His father was an affluent man who had risen up from poverty to become an executive, an accountant in the British railway system. And so he had a comfortable life. He had 7 siblings. He was the second oldest son. This is him at age 6, the earliest known photograph of him, and it's atop the cover of the book as well. They moved around a lot, and when he was 11, a very important and most traumatic incident occurred when his mother died, his beloved mother. And to his credit, a lot of gurus, a lot of these people who people regard as saints, and especially the renunciates, those who take vows and to renounce worldly life and devote themselves to the spiritual quest, like he did when he became a Swami, They don't speak much about their personal lives and their private lives, but he did, and he wrote about it. And the death of his mother was a compelling part of his story, and very deeply moving, especially when you discover things that he didn't say and write about himself. And then eventually, after moving around a lot, they settled in Calcutta when he was 13. He was already by then, I'll come to that. This is the home they lived in. In those days, the upper floor didn't exist, but his descendants still live there. His brother's grandchild lives there, and they maintain part of the place as a sort of shrine to their famous guru, grand uncle. And by the way, if you've been thinking of going to India, I lead tours, and we take people to places associated with the main gurus who came here, including the home and other sites in and around Calcutta. There's flyers for it there. And so I've been there a few times, and it's fascinating. Also fascinating was the neighborhood in Calcutta where he grew up, where he spent his teenage years, formative years, college years. I compare it to Greenwich Village in the same era. It was a hotbed of like creativity and intellectual ferment. There were universities there. It was the early stages of the freedom movement in India against the British colonial powers, and there were all these revolutionaries, young revolutionaries there, and gurus and ashrams and swamis everywhere, and all this had a big impact on Yogananda, and it was fascinating to explore. This is him at age 16. You can already see, and even earlier when he was like 11, when after his mother died, he got on a train to escape to go to the Himalayas and become a renunciate and live in a cave, and his older brother had to track him down and bring him home. And that happened 3 or 4 times while he was an adolescent. So he was marked for that kind of life right at the beginning. He knew what he wanted to be. And of course, his father was not very happy about that. And some of the family dynamics around having such an unusual child in a culture that was very traditional, especially when his older brother, seen here at the bottom, when Yogananda was a teenager, his older brother died at a very young age too. So he became the eldest son, which was a big deal. And you know, they arranged a marriage for him on 3 different occasions, and he turned them down. They arranged jobs for him and everything. He did go make his way through college despite having no interest in it, and graduating by the skin of his teeth through some miraculous events that you can read about. But he was marked for spiritual dedication, and as a leader, even as a teenager, he, you know, when you're a teenager, there are all these people who are sort of natural leaders who emerge in your crowd, and most of them are leading us to things like a ball game or a party or some mischief or another. He was leading people in what we in Sanskrit is satsang, spiritual gathering. He would take them to temples to meet gurus. He set up a meditation room in the attic area of his home, which still exists now as a kind of shrine. That's a picture I took when we were there. And if you go at the right time, they'll allow you to meditate in the room with them, and as we did. And that was his being a ringleader. He was also a bit of an athlete, which surprised me. He would also organize races. He was a very fast runner. And even as an adult living here in LA, he challenged people to, like, you know, races and ping pong matches and stuff. And those little human touches were part of the fun of organizing it, but of organizing the book. His Swadharma, his individual dharma, was obvious to him, his destiny, what he was meant to do. his role in life was obvious to him at an early age, but of course, no one around him would have supported that until he started meeting swamis and gurus, those early spiritual mentors. And then his Sadguru, the main guru, Sri Yukteswar, there on your right, who was a disciple of Lahiri Mahasya. And this is the lineage, if you ever go to any of the organizations teaching in Yogananda's name, you'll see those two people and others on the altar. This is the Kriya Yoga lineage that he became part of when he became a disciple of Sri Yukteswar. And that occurred after he graduated high school, and there's miracles around that story as well. And through his college years, he was sort of spending more time at the ashram than he did in classes. He was one of those academic underachievers who, academic underachievers, people who are bored by school, they either become slackers or they become great at what they're really interested in. And he was one of those. He would spend more time with the guru than the classes and just sort of made his way through with the help of others in his college days. But, this caused, obviously, concern by the family. And but he was marked as the one who would bring the teachings of this lineage to the West at a very early age, and there's stories around that. And then when he became a Swami, he was drawn to the life of seclusion of a recluse, of a renunciate, a sannyasi in Sanskrit. But that was not to be. His guru said, no, you're going to be an active monk. You're going to be an engaged monk. You're going to work. You're going to serve. You're going to do for your duty to bring these teachings to the world. You are marked for this. And that was a bit of an inner conflict of his for the rest of his life. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But the first thing he wanted to do, despite his disdain for conventional education, or because of it, he had ideas about what schooling should be. So he established a school with a couple of his Swami buddies, young people. They were in their early mid-20s. And this is a picture of him at the school they set up in the city of Ranchi, which is still a property belonging to his lineage. Early in, this would have been in the 19-teens. And, but he was only there for a couple of years when the calling came, an inner kind of calling that it was time to go to the West. And through a series of fascinating and interesting events, he actually did. And this is his passport photo. And you can see, he had the beard and the long hair pulled up in the turban of a traditional Swami. And how he got the passport and how he got a ticket on the boat and everything, all great stories. And he ended up on the first boat between India and the US since before World War I. Now the war was over, it was 1920, and he was on that ship. And sailed to Boston to speak at a religious congress run by the Unitarians, and this is him with some of the other speakers. You could see that he stood out. And you could see that he no longer has a beard, and that's an interesting story too, because some of the passengers, Americans on the ship, said, you're going to stand out, and we have racial issues in America, you have dark skin, you're going to look like a weirdo, maybe you don't need the beard. And so he shaved the beard on the ship, but refused to cut his hair, because that would have been too much of a violation of the life of a Swami. And how he adapted and how he was treated is another fascinating part of the story. Because you think about it, this is 1920, and he arrives in Boston at a time when the Ku Klux Klan was resurgent, and people in Boston area, it was always a very progressive and liberal city. This is the area of Emerson and Thoreau and great learning, but there was also a kind of opposite xenophobia. They were busy having problems with Irish people and Jews at the time, and here comes this heathen from an oppressed land that no one thought had any value whatsoever to offer us. And here he was standing out, and there were some great stories, like when he saw a sign for hot dogs. People eat dogs in America, and being directed to the ladies' room because people saw the long hair, and things like that, and being taunted and tormented in the streets at times, but at other times being treated very graciously. And he came to really love America, and so he stayed. When he left, and his father gave him the money to board the ship, his father was heartbroken and said, "How long will you be gone?" He said, 3 months, unless the Americans need me. We needed him. So, he stayed 3 decades instead of 3 months. Part of the adaptation, and this is an interesting part of the story, and one of the lessons we can learn, is like we always have to adapt to new environments, new events in our lives. And he's a great example of that. He was bringing these traditional teachings of India to a new culture, vastly different from what he had left behind. And how he adapted his language and the topics that he would speak about and the methods of delivery so that Americans would respond properly to them. It was an interesting part of the story. None of the gurus like him could have possibly succeeded had they not had that. In Sanskrit, it's called upaya, skillful means of bringing knowledge to people at a level they can comprehend and understand. And he had that in spades. And there's a million examples of it. But part of it was his appearance. And so here you see him in a kind of business attire with his hair pulled back. He would pull back his long hair and tuck it under his collar so it would look like, he had a regular haircut, except when he taught. When he taught, he wore the robes of, traditional robes, and his hair unbound up or in a turban. And when he was around his ashrams, when he was around his followers, he would dress in his traditional style. But out in public, there he was in snappy suits and a fedora. There are other pictures of him wearing the fedora. He's looking like, I thought, like, one of those dapper Latin men in Hollywood movies, But he suffered a good deal from the xenophobia and the religious bias and the racial bias of that era, which unfortunately, obviously has never gone away completely, but it was even worse then, and especially when he ventured into the South. But one of the things he did after 4 years or so on the East Coast, he established a foothold in Boston. He went from speaking to a handful of people in someone's living room to filling concert halls. He filled Carnegie Hall. He filled Boston Symphony Hall. All this, and then decided to go to the West Coast. He kind of knew that Los Angeles was the place where if he was going to establish a foothold in America, it would be there. He called it the Benares of America, which now we call Benares Varanasi. And those of you who have been there, it's the holiest city in India. And so he somehow had a sense that LA was the place. And so he set out on a cross-country trip, and this is him with his travel companions in a Maxwell. which they put on about 8,000 miles touring the country, and he even took a ship to Alaska. He was a great sightseer, and he would write very poetically about some of the places he visited, like Yellowstone and Pikes Peak and Yosemite and all that, and fell in love with the American landscape. This is in the mid-20s, 1924, when, before interstate highways, automobiles were first really catching on, and roads were being built, and roadside garages were being established and all that. So it was really primitive days. And beginning in Denver and then on to some of the West Coast cities, he gave public talks. One of the men, I can't see very well, but one of them was sort of the advance man, and he would go to the cities and set up publicity and arrange lecture halls and all that. And he established early on, again, adapting to the American way, he would give a free lecture in a big place and then a series of classes that people would pay for. And he had to be really convinced that, no, it's okay to charge money because you need to support, and it's okay to advertise. These are the things, gurus didn't do in India. And this is him before a poster for one of his talks in Denver, 1924, and then ended up in LA on January 2nd, 1925. He arrived and stayed at the Biltmore Hotel, and this is the ad in the LA Times for his first public lecture at Philharmonic Auditorium. And according to the LA Times, we did the research, the Philharmonic Hall held 3,000 people, and 6,000 showed up. And people had to, be turned away and all that. And he gave a series of these talks and then classes. And prominent Angelenos stepped up to be his patrons and supporters. And everything took off from there. And before very long, in 1925, how many of you have read Autobiography of a Yogi? Okay. How many of you have been to some of the facilities that are, so you've been to the Lake Shrine probably, and you've been to, how many have been to Mount Washington, the international headquarters up near downtown LA? That was the first of the properties that Yogananda established. I always say he had the best real estate karma of all the gurus who came here. All their properties are exquisite, and developers would kill to have those properties now. And even in India, the properties are beautifully landscaped and beautifully located. And so they found the location up a former resort hotel that had gone to ruin, up on top of a hill not far from downtown LA, Mount Washington. They bought it through the help of wealthy patrons, and cleaned it up and established it as a place of residence for devotees and their international headquarters, and it remains so to this day. They call it the Mother Center. And that was 1925. This is the Easter Sunday service that he held to sort of initiate or inaugurate the property. And everything sort of took off from there. And then the reality of running an organization and having this mission that was given to him by his lineage of gurus to bring these teachings to the West to as many people as possible, the reality of that had to set in, and that meant running an organization, managing human beings. This is not why somebody becomes a Swami. Especially somebody who, even at age 11, was running off to the Himalayas in hopes of finding a guru and living in an ashram in a cave. And his whole life, you see it in his letters, there were times when the frustration of being essentially a CEO of a nonprofit organization and a spiritual teacher to multitudes became overbearing, and the financial pressure and the hassles of human beings and living together and working together. I mean, if you've ever run a volunteer organization of even 5 or 10 people, you know why he called organizations hornets' nests. And the temptation to give all that up and just go back to India and be with the other monks along the Ganges or in the foothills of the Himalayas was always there, and he would express that to his credit, but he never did. You know that scene in Godfather 3 where Al Pacino says, every time I think I'm out of it, they pull me back? That's what happened to him. He always had that destiny, that mission, that vow that he was going to do this work that was given to him. And that always became the paramount thing. And it's another lesson to learn. His perseverance in the face of struggles and challenges that I didn't know he had, and that most devotees of Yogananda didn't know he had, because they don't talk about that much. But it was difficult work, especially in the 30s. It was the Depression, and the financial pressure on everybody was incredible. And here he was, somebody with, even though his father was an accountant and his brother was an accountant, he didn't know about this stuff. And he needed other people to step up and provide the expertise and write checks and, bail out the mortgage and all the rest of it all the time. The financial pressure never stopped. And you see it in his letters and his talks. But he didn't give up. The perseverance, that sense of mission and purpose, which you don't expect from a yogi, but they have it. The ones who become prominent have that just as much as any entrepreneur or a business leader or artist, with a sense of mission and purpose has. And that was very inspiring, and I think you'll find it too, that sticking it out and persevering and going through the difficulties and rebounding from setbacks, terribly interesting, because we have this sense that, high spiritual beings like him would have life easy, that everything would come naturally. And part of the reason we get on a spiritual path is because we think, then things will be easier and I won't have all these hassles. No, that's not the promise, because you're still in the world, and the world is crazy, and there's other human beings who make life difficult, and there's ups and downs. That will always be there. The promise is you'll have inner peace anyway, and you'll have presence of mind anyway, and you will not get set back and destroyed by these ups and downs, but you will learn from them and use them for your spiritual growth, and you will develop inner strength and inner peace so that you're impervious to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. But it doesn't mean they go away. When he was in Washington, he discovered American racism and established an African American study group, because African Americans were not allowed to come to the same places he did. This was the nation's capital, 1927. This was kind of lurid headlines that he had to deal with, rumors, scurrilous accusations, lawsuits. There were 2 big lawsuits, legal cases that he had to deal with, one at the end of the 20s, one at the end of the 30s, with people who had been close associates and friends. Terrible difficulties that he went through that I had to track down a lot of the details of and sort out what was true and what was not. All of them accompanied by headlines and all these salacious kind of accusations that people still argue about today. So if you're curious, you'll have to read those sections in my book and see what I learned and what is unlearnable. And he was essentially driven out of Miami because, he was teaching classes and most of the students were women, and there were husbands and brothers who did not like that. And this was very common, I found out. Back in the 20s and 30s, there were other gurus here, other teachers from India, and these were dark-skinned men with presumably hypnotic powers. And they, men did not like their women folk being, susceptible to this. It was a big deal. There were headlines and, all kinds of stuff. And he had to deal with all that. And those were the times when he said, I'm going back to India. I don't want to do this anymore. But he didn't. But he did go back to India for 1 year. And that was a memorable part of the research for me. It was very beautiful. He had the last reunion with his father. This is him with his beloved guru 15 years after not having seen him. And they had their reunion, and his guru would die while he was there, but he wasn't present, and his heart ached for that, and that led to one of the most memorable chapters in his autobiography, when his guru reappears after death to him and essentially gives him a guided tour of the afterlife and all the different realms that the soul can visit and inhabit. And this is him with Mahatma Gandhi, and I have to tell you, his support for Gandhi's freedom efforts and his associating with Gandhi when he went there caused the Brits to keep an eye on him. They were spying on him. This is one of the things I discovered. I saw memos from the British consulate about keeping an eye on this guy because he might be a subversive and a supporter of Gandhi. He might even be smuggling money to them and all this stuff. It was really interesting. And then, when he came back from India, he started a new phase of his life where he stayed in Southern California instead of running around all the time, and devoted himself to the legacy. And there were three things mainly. One was cultivating the close disciples so they could carry on after he was gone. The other was establishing more properties. So they had this, and you've been to the place in Encinitas? Fabulous location on the cliffs above, the ocean, and that was given to him by a wealthy donor, and it's still there, still a property that is maintained and it's beautiful. You can all visit. And he had a room there overlooking the ocean where he wrote most of the Autobiography of a Yogi and other works. And he would go to these different locations, a new temple in Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard, and of course wrote this. And then established the Lake Shrine, which sounds like many of you have visited, this great oasis on Sunset Boulevard near the ocean in America in 1950. And there's stories around all this stuff, but I want to wind it up. He knew for the last several years of his life that he didn't have long. He was ailing. It's never been entirely clear what whether there was a diagnosis, but he just, yogis have that sense. They know these things, and he knew he wasn't going to live a long life, and that he had limited time, and he worked even harder. He was in seclusion most of the time, but he was working really hard, surrounded by editors and stenographers and all that, to establish this legacy of written work that included the autobiography, but many other things, thousands and thousands of pages of written work, and establishing the properties and the people who would carry on after him. And that's how he lived the last few years of his life. And I have to tell you, researching his last few days and the day of his death at the Biltmore Hotel, where he first stayed when he arrived in LA, was really, really moving. And for a writer, it's lovely to have to narrate these nuances and details. He had said that he would die with his boots on, borrowing a phrase of ours, and that he would work to the end and would die with India on his lips, his beloved India. And as it happened, he was the keynote speaker at a banquet for the Indian ambassador visiting LA just 5 years after Indian independence, which he rejoiced in. And he gave the speech and concluded with a couple of stanzas from his own poem called My India, a paean to his homeland, and dropped dead of a cardiac arrest at the podium. I thank you all. It's a joy to be with you. Namaste.